The air inside the dimly lit restaurant carried the quiet hum of dinner conversations, punctuated by the occasional clink of silverware against porcelain plates. Jason sat at the table, his posture relaxed, fingers lightly tapping against the rim of his whiskey glass. Across from him, Vanessa shifted in her seat, her manicured nails drumming anxiously against the tabletop. She had chosen this place for a reason. Neutral ground, elegant but not intimate, somewhere public enough that she assumed Jason wouldn't cause a scene. She had rehearsed this conversation in her head countless times, imagining the different ways he might react. Would he rage, cry, plead for her to stay? She inhaled sharply and forced a sympathetic expression onto her face. "I need to be honest with you," she began, tilting her head as if trying to soften the inevitable blow. "I've met someone else." She waited. Jason took a slow sip of his whiskey, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable, the silence stretched, thick and unmoving. Then he smiled. "I know." Vanessa's breath hitched. Her fingers froze mid-tap, and for the first time in her life, she felt genuinely off balance. Jason reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his phone. With deliberate ease, he slid it across the table. "Go ahead," he said, his voice almost inviting. "Take a look." Vanessa hesitated, but curiosity won out. She picked up the phone and frowned at the screen. A document. Legal. Her name printed clearly in bold letters at the top. Her stomach dropped. Filed. Divorce petition. For a split second her mind couldn't process what she was seeing. She had prepared for devastation, for resistance, for anything but this. "You already knew?" she whispered, her voice thin. "Ah." Jason leaned back in his chair, exuding the kind of quiet confidence that had always drawn people to him. "I did," he said simply. "I've known for months." Vanessa's throat went dry. Months? Her world tilted as she realized what that meant. The nights she had slipped out, the text messages she had carefully deleted, the whispered calls in the car. None of it had been as discreet as she thought. Jason had been watching, waiting, and now he was the one in control. "Vanessa," he continued, leaning forward slightly, his voice as smooth as ever, "did you really think you were orchestrating this?" Her lips parted, but no words came. Jason exhaled, as if almost amused. "You thought you had the upper hand? That you'd come here, break the news, and I'd fall apart?" He shook his head. "But the thing is, I don't chase after people who betray me." Vanessa's pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had pictured Jason devastated, begging her to stay, fighting for her. But instead, he was the one who had planned everything. And suddenly she realized he was letting her go. A slow dread crept up her spine. Jason picked up his whiskey, swirling the amber liquid thoughtfully. "Ryan, he's your problem now," he said, his tone almost casual. "And something tells me you're in for a rude awakening." Vanessa's breath shuddered as she gripped the phone, her carefully constructed world cracking at the edges. Jason took one last sip, then set the glass down with finality. "You thought you were playing me," he murmured. "But I was already 2 moves ahead." And with that he stood, tossed a few crisp bills onto the table and walked away, leaving Vanessa to sit in stunned silence, staring at the divorce papers that had unraveled everything she thought she controlled. Vanessa sat motionless, the divorce petition still glaring up at her from Jason's phone. The quiet hum of the restaurant had faded into a dull roar in her ears, her thoughts a chaotic mess of disbelief, and something she wasn't ready to name yet. Panic. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. She had expected anger, devastation, maybe even a desperate attempt to win her back. But Jason had given her none of that. Instead, he had walked away without so much as a backward glance. It took a few more seconds before she found the presence of mind to move. Her hands trembled slightly as she set his phone back on the table, and for the first time in years, she felt small, insignificant. Jason, the man she had thought of as predictable, had just outmaneuvered her in every possible way. Her breathing was shallow as she reached for her own phone, her manicured nails clicking against the screen as she pulled up Ryan's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying its usual carefree arrogance. "Hey gorgeous, you done?" Vanessa hesitated, the words catching in her throat. For the first time, she noticed the way he spoke. Not with tenderness, not with warmth, but with entitlement. She had been so caught up in the excitement of being wanted, of feeling desired, that she hadn't paid attention to the finer details. Jason had said something before leaving, something that lingered in her mind like an unwelcome echo. "Ryan, he's your problem now." The thought unsettled her more than she cared to admit. I told him," she finally said, her voice thinner than she intended. Ryan chuckled. Bet he lost his mind, huh? Did he cry? Beg? Vanessa swallowed. No. He already knew. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, a short, humorless laugh. Knew? What do you mean, knew? Filed for divorce before I even said anything. Another pause, this time longer. Vanessa closed her eyes, suddenly hating the way she felt. Like a piece in a game she hadn't realized she was playing. Ryan finally spoke again, but his voice had lost its usual charm. So, what does that mean, exactly? Vanessa's grip on her phone tightened. She had imagined this moment playing out so differently. Her triumphant exit, her exciting new future with Ryan, but now, that future felt uncertain, and Ryan's hesitation wasn't helping. You said we'd be together, she reminded him, trying to grasp at the confidence she'd felt earlier. You said you'd take care of me. Ryan sighed, the sound grating against her nerves. Vanessa, that was when you were still married, when this was, fun. But if you're divorced, that changes things. A slow, suffocating dread crawled up her spine. What? She whispered. Listen, Ryan continued, his voice suddenly distant, dismissive. I gotta go. We'll talk later, all right? The line went dead. Vanessa stared at her phone, a cold weight settling in her chest. Jason had been right. The moment she was truly free, no longer a secret, no longer a stolen thrill, Ryan's interest had started to fade. The night air was suddenly suffocating, the noise of the restaurant unbearable. She stood on shaky legs, her world unraveling in ways she hadn't expected. Jason hadn't just walked away from her. He had left her standing at the edge of a life she had destroyed with her own hands. And now she had nowhere to go. Vanessa stepped out of the restaurant, her heels clicking against the pavement, each step feeling less stable than the last. The cool night air did nothing to ease the heat creeping up her neck, the slow burn of humiliation settling deep in her chest. She had been so sure of herself, so convinced that she had control, that Jason would shatter, that Ryan would be waiting with open arms, that she would land gracefully in the life she had carefully crafted in her mind. But reality had a cruel way of unfolding. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as she walked toward her car, her mind racing. Jason had known. He had known, and hadn't given her the satisfaction of watching him break. Instead, he had left her alone, sitting in the wreckage of her own choices. And Ryan? His reaction was even worse than she had feared. The casual dismissal, the way his voice had shifted the moment she no longer carried the allure of secrecy. It stung more than she cared to admit. She climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Her mind played out scenarios, each one leading to the same unavoidable conclusion. Jason was gone. Ryan was slipping through her fingers, and she had nothing. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, hope flared in her chest, irrational but immediate. Maybe Ryan was calling back, realizing he had overreacted. Maybe Jason had one last thing to say, but it wasn't either of them. Mom! Vanessa exhaled sharply, pressing the decline button. She wasn't in the mood for another lecture, for the inevitable "what were you thinking" that would come from the woman who had never approved of anything she did. But as she stared at the dark screen, a new wave of dread settled over her. She had spent so much time plotting her escape that she had never stopped to consider what came after. Where was she going to stay? Her apartment with Jason, his apartment now, was no longer an option. She had been so sure Ryan would take her in, but the way he had sounded on the phone, that wasn't happening either. And suddenly she saw herself as Jason must have seen her. A woman who thought she held all the cards, only to realize too late that she was playing the wrong game. Her fingers trembled as she opened her messaging app. Vanessa, can we talk? Please? She hovered over Ryan's name, her pride screaming at her not to send it. But pride wasn't going to put a roof over her head. The message was delivered. Read. 3 dots appeared. She held her breath, then they disappeared. No reply. Vanessa let the phone fall into her lap, staring blankly at the dashboard. She had thought she was making a choice that gave her power. Instead, she had just lost everything. Vanessa sat in her car, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the windshield. The silence inside felt oppressive, pressing against her like an unbearable weight. She had always been good at keeping control, at bending situations to her will, but now she was flailing, alone. She checked her phone again. Still nothing from Ryan. Her mind raced, searching for options. She could check into a hotel for the night, if she had access to money. With a sinking feeling, she realized that most of her finances were tied up with Jason, the joint account, the credit cards, the car lease. all in his name, and knowing him, knowing how methodical he was, he had probably already locked her out. Her stomach clenched at the thought. She tapped into her banking app, and her worst fear materialized in the form of a single notification. How to control panic attack. She let out a shaky breath. Of course, Jason hadn't just left her, he had prepared for this. Vanessa had always prided herself on being independent, on making her own choices. But the harsh truth was glaring at her now. Jason had been the foundation of her life. She hadn't built anything for herself. She had simply existed in the comfort he provided, all while convincing herself that she could do better. And Ryan? She squeezed her eyes shut, feeling her stomach turn. Ryan was never meant to be a real future. He was fun, a thrill, a momentary escape from a life she had convinced herself was dull. But now that she was standing on the edge, free of Jason, Ryan was nowhere to be found, and for the first time she realized he had never actually promised her anything. She had filled in the blanks with what she wanted to hear. Her phone buzzed, jolting her back to reality. Her heart jumped. Ryan, but it wasn't. It was from her mother. "Mom, Vanessa, where are you?" She clenched her jaw. She didn't want to hear it. Didn't want the "I told you so" that was sure to come. But as she sat there, staring at the cold, hard truth of her situation, she realized she had no other choice. She pressed call. Her mother answered on the first ring. "Vanessa," the relief in her voice was obvious. "Are you all right? I just..." Her throat tightened. "I need a place to stay. Just for a couple of nights." Silence. Then, a sigh. "Come home?" Vanessa nodded, even though her mother couldn't see. "Okay." As she started the car, her reflection in the rear-view mirror caught her off guard. She looked different. Not the confident woman who had walked into the restaurant earlier that night. No, this woman looked like a stranger, because for the first time in her life, Vanessa had no plan. The drive to her mother's house felt longer than Vanessa remembered. Each passing streetlight cast flickering shadows across her face, illuminating the stark realization that she was heading backward, not forward. This wasn't the triumphant reinvention she had imagined. It was a retreat. A surrender. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. She had spent years mocking people who ran back home when things got tough. Yet here she was, doing exactly that. As she pulled into the driveway, the familiarity of her childhood home sent an unexpected wave of emotion crashing over her. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow against the night. Her mother's silhouette was already visible in the doorway, waiting. Vanessa killed the engine but didn't move. Shame pooled in her stomach. She had left this house at 19, determined to carve out a life of sophistication and success. Coming back now felt like admitting she had failed at all of it. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to step out of the car. Her mother, Linda, crossed her arms as Vanessa approached, her expression unreadable. "I knew this day would come," she said simply. Vanessa flinched. "Can we not?" Linda stepped aside, allowing her in. "We'll talk inside." Vanessa swallowed her pride and entered. The smell of lavender and fresh laundry filled the air, unchanged from her teenage years. Everything was the same. Everything except her. She sank onto the living room couch, exhaustion weighing her down. Her mother sat across from her, waiting. "I don't need a lecture," Vanessa muttered. Linda arched a brow. "I wasn't planning on giving one," Vanessa scoffed. "Yeah, right," Linda sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I just want to know one thing. What were you expecting?" Vanessa blinked, caught off guard. "I mean it," Linda continued. "You left Jason thinking what? That Ryan was going to be your Prince Charming? That you'd live some grand, carefree life with no consequences?" A lump formed in Vanessa's throat. "I thought I'd be happy," she admitted quietly. "And are you?" The words cut deep. Vanessa looked down at her hands, the bright red polish on her nails now chipped and uneven. She had always prided herself on control, on making choices that benefited her. But sitting here now, she felt powerless. She thought of Jason's face when he handed her the divorce papers. Not angry, not broken, just done. She had underestimated him. She had underestimated everything. "Ryan doesn't want me now that I'm single," she finally said, her voice hollow. "He liked the game. He liked the chase. But the second I wasn't someone's wife, I lost my appeal." Linda exhaled, shaking her head. "Men like that never stay. You thought you had the upper hand, but you were just another piece in his game." Vanessa felt something crack inside her. "I screwed up." Her mother's voice softened. "Yes. You did. Vanessa inhaled sharply, bracing for the sting of shame. But it didn't come. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't pretending. She wasn't making excuses, shifting blame, or spinning things in her favor. She had destroyed something good, something solid, for a fleeting fantasy. And now? Now she had nothing. Linda studied her carefully. You know, Jason called me. Vanessa's head snapped up. He what? Linda nodded. Earlier tonight. He didn't sound angry. He just said he figured you might need a place to go, asked me to look after you. Vanessa's chest tightened. Even after everything, Jason had still thought about her. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. He was always too good for me. Linda's gaze was steady. Then why did you throw him away? Vanessa didn't have an answer. Silence stretched between them before Linda finally stood. Get some rest. You're going to need it. Vanessa barely nodded as her mother left the room. Alone, she stared at the ceiling, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She had no marriage, no lover, no home, and no future plan. For the first time in her life, Vanessa had truly lost. And there was no one to blame but herself.